Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you, listeners. This is Alman Nusrat, and
this is Nihal Khan, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
And you are listening to Faith in
Fine Print. we're never going to get this right.
We're working on it, guys.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show. We are here in Teaneck, New Jersey.
Yep. We are in Teaneck, New Jersey at Darul Islah, which is the masjid I grew up in. Mm-hmm. And they were kind enough to let us utilize the space to film our podcast. And, shout out to Mazhar Uncle, shout out to Imam Saeed, Sheikh Walid, Teaneck Hot Bagels, and everyone else in Teaneck and New Jersey that's here.
Yeah.
Because we know this is the best state in America. And, we want the barakah of the best state in America.
Yeah, that's funny because I think there's like one other episode where you were talking about Jersey and... All right. Anyways, we are here.
You got a problem with Jersey?
No.
Okay.
We're here in Jersey. We had those amazing bagels. And we're here at the show, recording the show.
Got an awesome guest with us.
Yes. And we came here on this rainy day for this awesome guest. And we think we're really excited to have her here. So Nihal, why don't you do a proper introduction?
Yeah, so our guest today is Rowaida Abdelaziz, a also New Jersey native and a journalist at the Huffington Post. She reports on civil rights, social justice issues within the Muslim community, Islamophobia, and specifically about rising anti-Muslim sentiment across the states. She's the lead reporter for the Islamophobia Tracker, a project that documents the anti-Muslim rhetoric that has been spiking across the states. And she also has launched Huffington Post tomorrow, inshallah, which we're going to ask her about because that's the response we give to everyone that invites us to our houses usually if we don't like them. Tomorrow, inshallah, right? It's a community Facebook page that targets and simplifies Muslim voices and perspectives. And since 2015, Rowaida has written 136 articles for the Huffington Post.
Wow.
So welcome, Rowaida. Thank you for joining us. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. So tell us about yourself. How's your journey been? How have you made your way to become a Huffington Post reporter? I know you were with Al Jazeera before, but yeah, what's the lowdown?
The lowdown. It's a great question. I'm super excited to be here, and as you mentioned, I grew up here in Jersey, so very familiar territory for me. I actually attended Rutgers University down in New Brunswick, where I was a journalism major, which did not go down so easily with my first generation Arab American, Egyptian American parents. And so I remember trying to explain to them why I was studying journalism and why I had such a passion for it. Even before I entered college, I remember my first experiences getting to understand the concept of journalism. I had started at this high school, internship where I got to work for the Home News Tribune, if we remember it, RIP, the Home News Tribune. It used to be a local paper here in Jersey, and they invited high school students to kind of come out and learn the foundations of journalism. And I loved doing it as a kid. I think the most exciting part was running to the blue boxes outside of our home and where you kind of grabbed the newspaper and you took it home. And I would rip through the first 15 most important pages of the newspaper because the end is where they put everything written by the teenagers. And I would see my name, Rowaida Abdelaziz. It was so long that it had to be breaking down onto 3 lines, the byline. And since then, I kind of was obsessed with journalism and pursued it at college. My parents had a lot of fears, right? There was safety concerns. There was, you're not going to make any money concerns. There was media back home to us means an extension of the regime and the government, and therefore we're concerned it's very similar here in the U.S. And had a lot of doctor cousins drop by for dinner casually and coincidentally for the longest time to sway me out of it. But I persisted, alhamdulillah, and I graduated with a degree in journalism in Middle Eastern Studies, and I started off working at Al Jazeera covering UN security news briefings, and specifically focused on Central Africa and the Middle East. I'm fluent in Arabic, so I think that really helped me break into the journalism world. And so when I started at HuffPost in 2015, I was still on their world news desk, and I was covering a lot of the refugee crisis that was happening in Syria and in Yemen. It kind of really took a turn after the Arab Spring until the 2016 election, when we started seeing a rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes, and Muslims and Islam were thrusted in the news cycle all over again. And my editors tapped into me and said, hey, this is a topic that we need to dedicate full time to. We know that you know your community well. And I had been providing a lot of behind the scenes work, editing other people's pieces, teaching them different etiquettes and how to report on Muslims until they decided that I needed to do it full time. And so I've took it on since, and that's what I've been working on for the last few years.
And it's cool that they recognize Islamophobia as a real threat, as a real thing. You were mentioning earlier in our conversations that basically a lot of people don't even recognize Islamophobia as a thing.
Yeah, people don't even want to legitimize the word, right? Mm-hmm. They say Islamophobia is a made-up term made to shut down the discourse and the critiques of Islam as religion, and people should critique Islam as they do Christianity, Judaism, all other religion. Mm-hmm. You have news outlets who don't even use the word Islamophobia. They don't recognize it. They substitute it for things like anti-Muslim hate crime or anti-Muslim bigotry. But HuffPost has been excellent and one of the leading outlets to say that this is not only a topic worth addressing, but it's not something that you can just debate, right? Islamophobia is not something where intellectuals can come around a cup of coffee and say, does this exist? Does this not exist? Mm-hmm. And so I'm super grateful to have been doing this at HuffPost. I'm an enterprise reporter, so I get to do more of the long-term in-depth work and uncovering a lot of the issues that many people don't talk about. And so doing so for a national outlet, I think is huge for HuffPost. And I've, it's a blessing that I'm able to do it full time.
Awesome.
Really cool.
So, you've been reporting on Islamophobia. I noticed that a lot of your articles revolve around, refugee resettlement and tracing Islamophobia throughout the world, specifically in the United States. But from what you've noticed, and from your research and from your journalism and your reporting and from your travels, what does Islamophobia look like in the world right now, and what should we expect post 2020?
That's a great question. I think we are just coming to terms with the depths and the nuances of Islamophobia. Like I was saying earlier, people think that this is something that's debatable, right? It's not. I think Islamophobia, people need to recognize it means so many things. I think on the ground, it means the mosques that are being vandalized, the Muslim women who wear hijab and are on the forefront of having it pulled off, kids being bullied in schools. It's also structural, right? It's also institutional. We're talking about policies and bills and legislations that get passed meant to target Muslims in Islam, whether that's the Patriot Act back in the day, whether it's NSEERS or now the Muslim ban, right? In which we've had multiple iterations of and an extension of. Right. So Islamophobia is complex. I think when you're covering bigotry against a faith group and one that is as large and diverse and is only growing, one like ours, we're talking about anti-Black racism, we're talking about gendered Islamophobia, we're talking about so many levels and different layers that are affecting different parts of our community. And I think we've been seeing that trend for the longest time, but it has really been heightened post 2016. And you mentioned the 2020 election, and I think Islamophobia is now being used as a political strategy, right? People are saying, well, if Trump could have said all these really problematic and Islamophobic things and become the president of the US, then I can win my local election, then I can win the state election. And so we're seeing it now where people are using it in targeted ads, people are using it in marketing, people are using it in their messaging, thinking that it's going to win them over political points. So I think we are still coming to terms with the fact that Islamophobia is so deep in that way. Right. And it's a matter of recognizing those complexities, then we can start actually addressing it.
Yeah, I think one thing which you had mentioned before was like, going from family wanting to, wanting you to be a physician versus you going into journalism, and then Alman being a singer-songwriter and like artist in general, right. And then myself having done a degree in psychology, a lot of times you are following what you want to do, what you want to be passionate about. And there's this like, I think it was a line from like Rami or something like that, the show. They're like, what is passion? That's a white person thing, right? It's like, right. And a lot of our parents may understand that because they come from a generation where like food on the table is what you needed to do to put food on the table, right. Security, a roof over your head. But I think in the generation that we're living in, that's not necessarily the issue, right? Like you can go work at a call center and put food on the table. But I think with our generation, and now having, I guess, crossed a certain threshold, families simply want you to see you succeed. And there is this give and take, this negotiating scheme that occurs where you need to really produce to your family that, hey, look, I'm ready to fight for what I believe in and to make this work if I truly believe in it. And I think a lot of young people need to understand that too. Like, it's not just about, and this was the point that I'm making about Islamophobia. A lot of times Islamophobia pursues in the community because people stay silent, right? Martin Niemöller said it that, people stopped standing up for, others that were different than them. And then there was no one left to stand up for me. But I guess that's something that's important to talk about, which is that in the community, Islamophobia sometimes is also internalized, right, amongst Muslims themselves, which goes into my next point. There are certain issues that you had written about, right, like swimming, domestic violence, and law enforcement in the community. I wanted to talk about your article on swimming, which had to go over that even for Muslim women that want to take a swim, right? Like, for example, in France, there were like all these Muslim women that were wearing like the burkinis, and they were forced to like remove them because it's too covering, right? It's too modest. But how does that, can you talk to us about like that article that you had written and what you had found from that point about politicizing a simple act to swimming for Muslim women?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things when people still talk about Muslims and Islam, we have tied our community so much to national security issues, right? Where anytime we reference Muslims and Islam, we're talking about the war on terror. We're talking about a refugee crisis in a different country. We're talking about hate crimes. But Islamophobia is so much more than that. And I think when I wrote about the obstacles Muslim women face when it comes to swimming, a part of it was just showcasing that, like, when Muslims want to do a very simple, very normal thing, it becomes problematic, right? Or it becomes a situation where they face discrimination or bigotry or hatred. And so I had interviewed Muslim women across the U.S. in very different states talking about their different experiences swimming, whether it was at the pool or at the beach or at a resort park. And not all of their experiences were negative, but a lot of them talked about, I should probably not swim because I don't want to go through the headache of it, right? There was the issue of like the swimsuit material itself. Muslim women were being kicked out of their pools because their outfits were quote unquote deemed unhygienic, right? And so we've seen this line being used before of pointing out hygiene to mask racism. We saw it when it comes to the Black community when they were swimming back in segregated America and how this was used for them to be kicked out of the pool. So it's just kind of been reinvented now for Muslim women. And so many Muslim women that I've talked to are just like, we just quit swimming. We don't go to the beach. We don't go to the pool anymore. It's something we leave for our male members of a family. And when we like go maybe back to Malaysia, right, when we vacation there, if we vacation in Dubai, right, then perhaps we'll go swimming there, which also can have very Islamophobic policies, right? Yeah. Egypt has banned the burkini in certain resorts and pools. Yeah, because they say it messes with the reputation and the look of the resort when they're trying to attract Europeans and Americans, which is a very colonial mindset. And so it's not just in the U.S., it's happening all around the world. So I talked to a lot of these Muslim women, and I followed this one particular woman who was immensely powerful and took me on her journey as seeing a family member, I think it was an aunt of hers, being kicked out of a pool when she was quite young and swore off ever swimming in America. She was just like, I don't want to go through that. As long as I'm hijabi, I'm not going to swim. And we went with her for the first time having her swim in America. And it was very heavy and it was very loaded. And she said, look, it's not that I'm not proud of my hijab. It's not that I'm afraid of other people. It's just that this is such an emotional process for me that I'm first worried about the way I look. I'm worried about people saying these things. I'm worrying about even allies, right? People who tend to just want to quote unquote free Muslim women. It becomes this complicated process where people just want to swim. People just want to have a good time. But it becomes this political act. It becomes a form of resistance almost for Muslim women to start doing that. And I wanted to capture all of those nuances, right? That, Halima Aden was on the cover of Sports Illustrated in a burkini, and there was a rise of burkini sales. And so like the capitalist portion of Muslim women swimming, you had American companies now. Kulibar is a popular one. They launched the swimsuit line just for Muslims and hijabis. But the reality on the ground is that Muslim women were buying it, but they were keeping it in their closets because they were so afraid. Right. And so there was an irony here. And so the report kind of captured a little bit of that irony, talked about, yes, the political fears, yes, the women who were kicked out of There was a woman who was kicked out of the YMCA. There was a woman who started yelling racial slurs. There was a woman who's like, when Trump gets elected, who she told me they're going to kick you out of our pools. There was this one mom who was pregnant, and they were at a resort out in Ohio where she had 3 different managers come to the back of her hijab and needed to flick the tag of her bikini to make sure that it was actually swimsuit material. So all of these experiences, I think, weigh heavy on Muslim women, but they're resisting and they're swimming, and I think we're seeing a lot more of them now. I think we're seeing a lot more accommodating places to women who don't want to, say, go to a public beach. We see pools that are opening up for Muslim women. And this was one of my favorite stories because I think it takes away from the fact that, like, anytime we talk about Muslim women, I don't want to talk about just oppression, and I don't want to talk about the war on terror. I want to talk about the Muslim American experience, which is one that is very real and very different from what I think mainstream Americans think about when they think about Muslim women.
Did you see any parallels with this with other faith communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen this quite often with the Jewish American community. Jewish women also have very similar restrictions and dress very similarly, and also Amish women. As well. And so when you're looking at the sales in particular, it's not just Muslim women who are buying it. There are women from other faith communities and some women who are not belong to a specific faith, but just want to dress more conservatively, more modestly. And I had gotten a lot of emails actually from white American women who identify as white American. They told me in their emails who were just older and who said, we don't feel comfortable wearing a 1-piece or a 2-piece. We like the way that these women dress. You have women who had, or men, sun sensitivity, right? And so they just wanted to cover. And so I think when you're looking at the sale side and the different diversity of the people who tend to dress that way at pools and beaches is a lot more diverse than we think.
That's crazy. Wow. So even down to, like, you know, I can only imagine the issues that Muslim women may face. Right, on one end, you have to worry about someone from outside your faith community policing how you dress, and then you have people from within the Muslim community telling women how to dress, right? And I think that becomes, you know, a double-edged sword for a lot of sisters, right? And, you know, that's why many may kind of distance themselves from the faith. It's like you don't feel safe in the faith. You don't feel from people within the faith, and then you also don't feel safe from people beyond the faith. And I think people need to learn to cut, you know, Muslim women a little bit of slack. Just take a step back. And I think, like you mentioned, colonialism, right? When we had an episode talking about, like, the idea of decolonizing the Muslim community, which kind of gets into my next point. How important are narratives? And for those of you that don't know, there's was a scholar of comparative literature at Columbia University named Edward Said, right? Edward Said spoke about the idea of Orientalism, where the East or the West decides that the East cannot represent itself, right? The entirety of it. So they must be spoken for. So meaning what? In Islam, for example, a woman can testify, right? A woman can own property and stuff like that. But it's only in, like, the modern post-colonized Muslim world where, like, no, Muslim women should not speak. They shouldn't have any voices. They shouldn't be spoken or spoken to. There should always be someone to speak on their behalf. So that gets into my next point. Like, what's the importance of narratives in the Muslim community? Which goes back to, again, journalism, right? Artistry and psychology and Islamic studies, whatever. But I feel like the reason a lot of us go into these fields is there's a very inner, deep connection to wanting to tell one's narrative. So how should we imagine that, you know, moving forward?
I think it's breaking the idea that there is only one narrative. And I think this is something that mainstream media struggles with when it comes to representing Muslims. And I think this is something we as Muslims struggle with, right? I think because we have been on the defensive for so long, the narrative has been, we are the good guys, right? We're not the bad guys, few bad apples in the bunch. And this has kind of been the same talking point. I mean, what makes Edward Said's research and his literature so incredible is that it applies so much to modern day media, to modern day narratives and representation of Muslims, even though he himself was not a Muslim, right? Yeah. But his work is just so powerful. And I think the foundations of every poli-sci, every journalism, every media majors person. And so I think when it comes to the concept of narratives, we need to understand that more is better, right? We in Islam have been taught that the reason we have the way fiqh is built, that there is healthy debates. People negotiate with one another, we study the historical references, and that this is healthy. I think about the issue of the moon sighting, right? Yeah. Where we all know the moon wars is a thing every Ramadan and every Eid, but the diversity is healthy. And I think we don't look at the discourse as being something that allows us to learn and to grow. And I think that's applicable in media. We need to understand that we are not a monolith, that the Muslim community is so insanely diverse racially, religiously, within different genders. And so I think we need to embrace that. And when we're talking about media representation, we're not just saying terrorist group did something bad, they're not part of Islam, we and Muslims are good people, and just going back to the same defensive mindset. We need to become more proactive. We need to see more voices from women. We need to see more voices from Black Muslims, Latino Muslims, from convert Muslims, and need to understand that there's going to be different layers and discourses. And I think that's the only way that this one-sided narrative of Islam and Muslims in the media is going to change. Because right now we have either the stereotypical Muslims are violent, Islam is bad, or you have the moderate Muslim narrative where it's just like, well, my Muslim neighbor is great, but like Islam as a whole is problematic. And it's very binary right now. And I think the way that we're going to break out of it is having more narratives and different, a lot more healthy discourse. And that's going to be uncomfortable. And I think we as Muslims are not fully there in terms of bracing that discomfort. But I think once we do that, we'll be able to open the doors where we don't feel the need, like you were saying, to have our kids in our generation just go into STEM because they need to provide food on the table, right? Mm-hmm. I work for a pretty progressive liberal outlet, but on the editorial side, I'm the only Muslim that I know of, right? Wow. And I'm the only hijabi. And so I think if that's something at an outlet like HuffPost, I don't really know what the makeup at Fox is going to be, right? Or even something as centrist as CNN and the New York Times. So we need to encourage our communities to break out of the one-dimensional careers because, alhamdulillah, we're at a place now where we can be a little bit more secure, a little bit more financially stable, a little bit confident in ourselves, that we need to encourage each other to go into more diverse fields.
That's basically kind of my experience of breaking out of the mold and doing something different, being a singer-songwriter. First of all, kind of demonstrating to people that that's something that's relevant, that's something that matters, your place in arts and culture, because really ideas get passed down through the arts and culture, right? That's how it becomes a part of our cultural experience, what we experience as acceptable or unacceptable. Art, music, theater, all of these things are just such powerful ways to communicate an idea. And I discovered for me, one of the challenges was because my music is very kind of alternative. It's alternative pop, right? So it sounds like something that would be on the radio, but the lyrical content is spiritually inspired. So it's kind of like a mixture. And I think a lot of people had a difficult time kind of marrying those two things in their mind because it's like, well, either has to be overtly Islamic or it has to be not. Right, or it has to be just like, One Direction or something. I don't know what people listen to. What's
Sirat al-Mustaqim?
What's that thing that people listen to? That is K-pop band.
Oh, from
BTS.
From BTS. Yeah,
You're a fan? Are you a fan of BTS?
I see them a lot. I've never heard any of their songs actually.
So yeah, I feel like it has to be. They feel like it has to.
So
be
you want to be BTS?
Maybe. Yeah, there you go.
Apparently, there's a huge fan base in the Muslim community of BTS.
Really?
Like,
For sure.
Someone did a piece about how
K-pop in general.
K-pop in
like
general, exactly. Thing. Yeah.
But yeah, so like either being overtly Muslim and Islamic, and having songs that are like
Meher Zayn,
the sky is blue, alhamdulillah. We just maybe it works for. Yeah, I thought you were saying whoa, don't hate on it. No, I'm not hating on it, but there's that kind of content, and then there's the type of music that I've done, and there is that narrative of like it either has to fit here or it has to fit there, and that's problematic for me because my experience is, Islam is like in everything you do. It's your whole life, your emotions. It's a spiritual experience. What we're experiencing now is a spiritual experience, life in your emotions, whether that's love, happiness, sadness, whatever it is. And so that communicates through my music, and sometimes ideas like that are hard to communicate to a lot of Muslims, and so they need to kind of, and that's why I think the artists, the writers, the poets, the actors, all of these people, they have to have that voice so that we understand that there's a middle ground, because Islam at the end of the day is the middle path, and we need to have both. And I think as you mentioned, just echoing your sentiments, I think being active in these roles it's really important for us as a community.
Yeah. I think what we can do at this point, because I wanted to get into another topic, but I think it'll be a little bit longer. So I think we can take a 5-minute early break and then pop back into it.
Cool. So we're going to take a break right now, and we're going to have a message from our sponsor, the Mantle. Yeah, there you go.
There we go. We've been trying to like match up our.
That was good. That was good.
Yeah.
So this is a message from the Mantle, and we'll be back shortly.
Hey listeners, wondering what the Mantle is? The Mantle is an organization based in Fairfield County, Connecticut. We are dedicated to creating sacred spaces that facilitate the understanding of Islamic spirituality. The Mantle aims to revive the prophetic tradition of understanding, compassion, and spiritual cultivation. We encourage authenticity in exchange for authenticity. Come as you are to learn Islam as it is. Find out more about the Mantle by following us online on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Mantle of Love. We hope you enjoy the rest of this episode of Faith in Fine Print.
What's up, everyone? We're back from the break. We took the break that we needed, I think.
Yes, we did.
We had some technical difficulties, but I think we're okay now. So we're here with Sister Rowaida Abdelaziz, a journalist, a writer for the Huffington Post, and she has written how many articles, Nihal?
136.
136. So she's well-versed in the issues that present themselves to the Muslim community, the American Muslim experience. We talk about that. We talk about Islamophobia. We talked about Muslims taking a hold of their narrative and changing the way that they're perceived by being active in different capacities in pop culture and in journalism and in other fields as well. So Nihal, what do we want to dive into next?
Yeah, so there was another article which actually I think as of most recent, which Rowaida had written a couple of months ago, which kind of popped up on my timeline, was the one about domestic violence. And I had noticed that she had also done an interview about it. And on my own end, having been somebody involved in the Muslim community, having counseled couples and stuff like that, domestic violence is a common issue in the Muslim community. Many times towards women from men, and oftentimes also against men from women. Mm-hmm. And it's perpetuated in many different ways. And I think Rowaida's article that she had spoken about was about, to a very, very heavy degree, of, in one instant, a father killing a mother and then also eventually taking his own life, and what scars that left on her. And in my experience, from what I've noticed, and I want to talk to Rowaida about, often when we talk about domestic violence in the Muslim community, it's like, oh, why are you airing our dirty laundry? Oh, why are you talking about this openly? So I guess I wanted to talk about that article. What was some of the pushback you got? What was some of the benefit that you found from people reaching out to you, and just the general reaction you got?
Yeah, I had this project kind of listed in my notebook of things that I wanted to tackle for a really long time. And I'd have to say this was the most challenging piece that I've ever done in my work. And I think it's because there were so many nuances that I really needed to be aware of. And so I think one was, of course, wanting to address that issue that domestic violence and gender-based violence exists in the Muslim community. But at the same time, I was aware of the pushback I was going to get from our own community, of this concept of, quote unquote, airing our own dirty laundry. And the second one was not wanting to empower the racists and the bigots and even the white saviors who would potentially use this article and say, well, this is why Muslim women need saving, or this is why Muslim men are so violent, or this is why, and then insert justified some sort of backwards thought. And so there were a lot of different heavy things that were really weighing on me. So I wanted to give the story the justice that it was going to allow the Muslim community to discuss this issue in our space, but also allow people outside of our community that know that we need to have this conversation and that we are having these conversations, and that this is something that is not more or less prevalent in our particular faith community, that this wasn't going to be used as a weapon for other people. And so I tried to touch upon all of those things. I had talked to multiple Muslim agencies that tackle domestic violence in the Muslim community, specifically in the U.S., from Virginia to Texas to the Bay Area, New York, and talking to dozens of survivors themselves, right? And all of the survivors, except for the one that you mentioned, wanted to talk anonymously. And I think this highlights the taboo and the issues that we have in our own community not wanting to address it. I think internally we don't address it just because of some strong patriarchal culture that comes. I think that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it is we already have so much negative attention. You know, people are attacking us, our mosques are being vandalized, our women are being attacked. This is on the low priority of the list that we need to address as Muslims. And that's not true, right? You have the case of this woman. We all know the case of Asya Zubair, who was murdered brutally in around 2009. And there are other cases of Muslim women who are not just being killed, but are being emotionally abused, being financially abused, right? When we're talking about abuse, it's not the physical markers, right? It's so much more complex than that. And then there's the issue of the misconception of the faith. And people think that this is perpetuated by the faith. And so one thing that I also talked about, I talked to numerous imams, Khalid Latif was one, and I talked to others who made it clear that this isn't a faith issue, right? And you're going to find abusers who will weaponize the faith. And this is not something that's specific to the Muslim community. We find it in other faith communities where people will find any text, whether it's religious text or other types of texts, to keep their victims at bay, to justify the abuse that they're doing. And so there was also the demystifying and I think clarifying the faith. And I think most of us know and we believe that Islam doesn't perpetuate domestic violence, but we also know that there is an issue, whether it's the masajids don't want to address it because they're afraid that their abusers are their donors, right? Mm-hmm. And they don't want to, stop the stream of money. There's also the issue of just the ignorance that sometimes comes from faith leaders. And so I think one of the most fascinating things in my research, I learned that even though domestic violence doesn't discriminate and it plagues the Muslim community just as equally as it plagues other faith communities, and this was statistics that came from the ISPU by Dani Mujahid, her organization, what was interesting is that Muslims tend to go to their faith leaders first before they went to working professionals. Mm-hmm. And this was higher within the Muslim community. So oftentimes after friends and family, they went to their imams or local shuyukh, whereas people in other faith communities tend to, say, go to a therapist or a social worker first. And so imams are finding themselves more in this position where they're able to quote scripture. They can talk about the importance of being patient. They can talk about the rights of women. But do they know when to call the police? Right. Do they know when to call a local shelter? Do they know that a Muslim woman needs to be taken out of a place and it has to be somewhere safe? And so there was a gap between the relationship between these incredible organizations that I was meeting and talking to, and then your traditional masjid, especially if it's a small masjid or one that isn't financially stable. Mm-hmm. They weren't so well aware of those resources. So there have been awesome organizations, Peaceful Families, one based in Virginia, that what they do with Imam Majid is explicitly train imams, like when you get a survivor, this is how you interact with her, things that are built upon the deen. And I think the misconception is that it goes against the faith, that, we're breaking up families. That's usually like the biggest misconception that these organizations get, that you're going against the teachings of Islam. But that's not the case. A lot of these organizations are just putting human rights, and human rights are Islamic rights, right? They're one and the same. And oftentimes we're prioritizing the needs and the protections of women. And so all of these, there are so many different themes here that I was tackling on, plus the concept of Islamophobia. A lot of the Muslim women were talking to me that sometimes they didn't want to speak out because they didn't want to perpetuate the stereotype that when women were weak and that men are inherently violent. Mm-hmm. Or that when they did go seek help, that some people have told them, well, isn't this normal? Like in your faith, that men treat you this way. Right. And so they were being re-traumatized a lot of times at these agencies and going through more discrimination and more hatred. So now the second and third time around that, they were not so likely to go to seek help because they were facing Islamophobia, right? Shelters who didn't offer halal food or places to pray or clothing for women to be covered. There are now shelters. There was this one incredible woman out in the Maryland, Baltimore region who opened a house that strictly is for Muslim women. Mm-hmm. And so that she's
able... Is that Asma Hanif?
Yes.
Okay.
And so that she is able to provide a lot of these amenities and able to protect these women from a Muslim and Islamic perspective. And so there are organizations out there doing the work. I think so many people just didn't know about them. So this was also an amazing chance for me to highlight some of the incredible work that these organizations were doing.
Wow. And that's really interesting as well, because in the community, like you said, it's always like, very hush hush if somebody's going through a domestic issue, or if there's someone talking. It's actually that point you just mentioned about for Muslims to be going to their faith leaders before they go to anyone else to get help. You mentioned that's, according to research, is more common amongst the Muslim community than other faith groups?
Correct, according to the data by SPU.
Wow. Okay, that's really interesting. Which goes back to chaplaincy and whatnot. And I think a lot of imams are getting trained in pastoral care. Specifically, they're being taught to do CPE, which is clinical pastoral education, where they'll situate an imam or whoever, or a Muslim community leader, into like a hospital for 8 hours a day for a whole week, in which they're literally learning in the ER how to counsel to a family member who's like, I had one friend tell me like a crazy story about like how this 5-year-old, the mother sat him at the front of the car and they got into an accident and he wasn't wearing a seatbelt and he literally just, flew out the windshield. Wow. And at that point, like, obviously the doctor is going to try to do whatever they can, but like they'll bring in this minister or the imam and they'll be like, hey, listen, imam, this woman did this thing where she put her kid in the front. She shouldn't have done it. And now he is on the operating table, basically about to die. Go console her in that moment. And like these imams and these like, preachers and whatnot, or ministers, are being taught how to deal with that type of trauma in real lifetime action. Like, and I think specifically in the case of domestic violence, the community has to learn how to prepare, how to deal with it, right? How to prepare for it. And more often than not, it's like, oh, you're airing our dirty laundry. It's like, you know what? Yes, we are airing our dirty laundry. It's because sunlight is the best form of disinfectant, because when we try to keep things so insular, they're not getting solved.
Yeah, and I think it was fascinating because it shows to me what the role of an imam in the Muslim community is, right? I think we don't just go to our imams, or I think more so among our elders and young people, to get a fatwa. We're not going to like, can I make wudu, in the sink water at work. People are going because there are other issues. We go for issues, whether it's with the family or within someone's marriage or a home crisis or a financial crisis. And so they need to be well versed in things outside of scripture and theology, because when we're looking at the American Muslim community, we have so many other issues, and sometimes the priority isn't about the specifics of wudu or can I, pray asr when I'm traveling, and it's about what do I do when my kid is going through this issue, or when my husband, who's a donor at the masjid, is being abusive. And I think it's a high level thinking that we need to recognize, okay, if imams are being approached with these questions, are they well resourced and capable of coming up with tangible solutions?
Yeah.
How do we like address that situation? A lot of the mosques around our country, is it like, how do we address the issue of the mosque leaders or the people in positions of leadership to take the initiative to learn about how to deal with these situations, right? Like, because we have in some of the the successful communities, I would say, like people who are active and who are doing these programs like you mentioned, where they've been around intense situations where they have to deal properly with it. But then there's a lot of communities with huge congregations where people are completely like I remember I was in Jackson Heights in New York, and huge mosque in Ramadan, just like hundreds of people, and the imam at the end of it was like, oh, by the way, if you're diabetic and you take your insulin, your fast is broken. And which is, from my understanding, an area of difference of opinion and when it comes to insulin and stuff like that. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but something like that, and without any questions or any kind of it can become an issue. But I mean, that's one thing. That's like, whatever, maybe he was right. But in other issues where like there's domestic violence or like, people are going through crises, what are they saying and how are they dealing with it? And because I know that that's the first place people turn to is the mosque or the imam, because he's supposed to be like this therapist, healer, imam, leader rolled up into one. And that's a problematic. And on the other side of it is like, where's the female representation in that? Because we don't have necessarily female imams, but we need to have their voice so that they can help women in those situations, which is why the domestic violence, like, the house that was created for them is useful, because we have those people who are there as it's like a support center. But yeah, my question is just like, how do we help our community in that regard?
Yeah, the answer is you just very heavily triggered me, and I can have a whole nother episode on this.
What did I trigger you regarding? I was looking at your face when I said the thing with fasting, so I don't know if I was...
No.
Yeah.
I'm not going to bother with that, but I actually have a very different view. I think we should retire the term imam because of the fact that it has a lot of baggage associated to it, in which we make people do things according to that title, which they never historically did. Historically, where did the term imam come from? It used to be a faqih, somebody who was trained in the law, or it was somebody who was a scholar of hadith, right? Like Imam Bukhari, right? Did Imam Bukhari do like counseling of marriage couples? No, he didn't. Right? Then afterwards, it morphed into becoming something associated to mosques, in which their sole purpose was to lead prayer and like give government issued khutbahs, and that's it. And then colonization happened, and we just did Control-C, Control-V, and applied that for every single masjid here. So does Islam say there cannot be female leadership? No. The issues come up in like who's leading prayer, this and that. But like a prayer leader and a full-blown pastoral care trained leader in your community are two different things. Right. So I'm of the opinion in our masajid we should have like 5 full-time or part-time employees, the executive director, a woman scholar, a resident scholar, somebody that leads prayers, and a youth director. You should have those 5 positions, part-time or full-time, depending on your community, and work like that. But coming back to what we were talking about, I think that, like I said, it's a whole podcast for a different time period. And as someone who's been working with the community for however long I've been working, and number 6, an executive director, who's an administrator.
Yeah, and I think the statistics also show that younger people are not really going to the masajid, right? And I think the function of the masajid, sure, like people should come to pray and people should come to participate. And yes, we should have all those positions to do all of these things. But I think we need to just look at it from a women's perspective. I mean, we're talking about like women survivors when some of these masajid don't even have women's spaces to pray, right? So it's just like we want to tackle X, but we're still at B. And so I think we need to make sure that like, yes, I'm not saying destroy the masajid, we have no spaces for them, but one, make sure that they're adequate, and then we have these spaces and the spaces to address these issues, and 2, supporting the current ones. Like a lot of these organizations are operating on bare minimums, right? And most of the donations and the grants that they're getting are from people outside of the community. Because again, I think going back to colonial mindsets, when we even look at our charities, for example, like the first thing we think about is let's send money back to Palestine, right? Or Kashmir, or organizations and things abroad. And yes, we should help them. And yes, absolutely, we should do that. But we don't look at our own backyards, right? The domestic, like Asma Hanif's organization is barely making rent and is barely being able to keep the shelter open, which she herself resides in, also partly by choice because she wants a form of intimacy with these women, and partly because she has to. It's her own home. And so we have to support the current organizations that are doing this work. People think that there aren't organizations that are here. Since we're in Jersey, I'm going to shout out Wafa House here in Jersey. In New York, there's Turning Point. We mentioned Peaceful Families in Virginia, Asian Women's Shelter out in the Bay Area. And so I think these organizations, we need to think about them during our fundraisers, during Ramadan. Yes, we want to have beautiful carpets imported from Turkey in our masajid, but oftentimes we need to keep our women alive and safe and protected. So I think it's not even an issue of should or should not an imam be involved in these spaces. It's let's empower the spaces of the women who are trained to do this work, have the licensing to do this work, and we need to keep their lights on because those spaces can function and coexist parallel and alongside the masajid.
Yeah, just random, but like, the thing that people talk about often, it's a talking point, like, oh, women should pray at home, don't come to the masjid, right? Just a random finding that you find. There's only 2 hadith in the entire tradition that talk about that aspect. And more often than not, scholars of hadith will mention that it was an issue that came up in regards to 2 specific individuals, meaning that, hey, we can't make it to the masjid. What can we do? We don't want to lose out on the reward. Like, no, because you're taking care of your family, then the reward is reversed, so you get more praying at home. But al-'ada al-muhakkama is a point mentioned in like usul, right? That the practices that you are living a part of, they become your source of derivative law. So like in 2020 in the United States, like really, dude, you don't have a proper place to pray for like your sister or your mother or your wife if they want to attend the masjid. Like, what world are you living in? You know, and that's another whole thing. Like, you can go on about all the different hadith that exist about that. But yeah, creating safe spaces helps us to unpack a lot of the trauma that we have as a community, which includes this form of internalized Islamophobia, which is like overtaking us from within and from outside. And if we're not doing that, then we're failing the communities. And it's like what you mentioned, great, build a $10 million masjid, but at the expense of your human resources, Allah's going to ask you about that on the Day of Judgment. What are you thinking?
It's a lot, man.
It is.
It's heavy. I mean,
I wasn't expecting for us to like get into those things.
Yeah.
But.
I mean, I mentioned this in a previous episode. You know, I have 2 older sisters, and then my father passed away in 2011, and my mom, you know, she's been a pillar of our home and our family, and then so many aunties and my grandmother. So I was like around women, and it's just weird because it's like, you know, one of my teachers told me that he asked the audience, the class that I was in, he said, "Is it possible to climb Mount Everest with one arm and one leg?" And then, you know, the audience was quiet, and he was like, "Well, maybe you'd probably die doing it, right?" So he was like, but he compared it to, you know, the inclusion of the sisters in our community and empowering them in terms of, you know, their access to education, their access to the mosque. He said they're the other arm and the other leg. And that's how we can traverse the mountains. So the problems that come our way, we do it together, men and women. And that's how I see it, because it's like, you know, if I go to the mosque or if I go to these certain circles and certain places and only men are there and only men are acquiring it, then what happens to the women and where are they left? Because there's some women that I've met who are completely unfamiliar with, like, for example, the process of Jummah, you know, and what the Friday prayer even consists of and how to perform it. And then like a whole list of other issues. And I think that's really problematic because, and it's weird and it's ironic because a lot of times, you know, they're the closest to their children, right? Because a mother, no one can replace a mother, and she's a first source of like wisdom and like what she's giving to the child. And it's just sad that we don't have those spaces for them to accommodate them. But the biggest thing that, you know, my biggest point is that by not granting access, by just not having those spaces, we are losing 50% of our potential. More, right? And that is just something that I can't even wrap my head around, because it's like all these issues that come about. So many of the issues that come about are like just they're issues of like decency. They're issues of humanity, of mercy, of creating shelters, creating spaces, taking care of certain individuals in our community. And that's like a feminine, that's like a thing that the woman would have done if they were given the access. They would have taken the stand, they would have done it. And even the situations now, they are women running these programs because they're capable and they get it. And it just shows the kind of the not just the fragility, but also kind of the incapacity of
the toxicity, the fragility, like just call it out.
Yeah, but
right?
like, you know,
toxic masculine fragility.
Right, like they couldn't do it, they didn't do it, and then now, alhamdulillah, they're having progressive communities that have created those spaces, and the women have access now, and they're doing it, and they're doing it better than the men could have ever. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like we can go on.
We can reserve this for our episode with Amina Darwish.
Yes.
So we're doing. She's the Columbia Muslim chaplain. So I was like, "Hey, Amina, what do you want to do an episode on?" She goes, "Angry dudes at the masjid." so we literally decided to title it "Angry Dudes at the Masjid," covering female Muslim leadership.
Oh, that's incredible, and it's a conversation worth having. And there are so many ways to doing it. I dedicated the last year of my reporting to issues of Muslim women. So I did the swimming one, and I did the domestic violence one. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do it so much is because statistic after statistic, I was seeing that Muslim women are on the forefront of Islamophobia. Right? Mm-hmm. They are getting the punches from the outside. They're being tackled for the way that they look. They are the visible markers of our faith, right? Oftentimes Muslim men can be racially ambiguous. People don't really know, are you from? Are you Latino? Are you brownish? Brown can mean so many things. But with Muslim women, it doesn't matter where they're from, whether they're Black Muslim women, Arab Muslim women, the Islamophobia is there. And then being attacked for the gender is there, right? And so you're outside and you are expected, because you are being held to a different standard, an impossible standard, that you are representing that the most perfect faith, that you must be the most perfect person. And it is a lot. The toll of it is so heavy to only kind of come back to your home, to come back to your community in order, expecting that you're going to be welcomed and appreciated and loved for all the punches you get on the outside. And then you just get punched some more on the inside, right? Because then you have all the expectations and the restrictions and the objectification from your own men and our own families and sometimes our own culture. And that's painful. And so there's just constant just trauma upon trauma, and just watching them not only just take these gut punches, that Muslim women were not just accepting it, but they were thriving in ways that were just incredible. And I think that continues to amaze me, and not just outside in the world, right? We talk about the first Muslim women in Congress. We talk about Muslim women in politics. We talk about Muslim women leading these amazing activist organizations. But even in our masajid, in our communities, in our own homes, you talked about your mom. I think about my mom coming as a new immigrant, raising 4 incredible children who, are successful, being involved in our masjid, being a wife, being, a career person. And they thrive in ways that, it just continues to amaze me. And just seeing some of the work that they do, more Muslim women are getting graduate degrees more than Muslim men here in the U.S.
Right.
They are donating to charities more than Muslim men. They are more likely to support different activist groups. And so to do all of that and to thrive and to succeed at such rates, despite all of the odds being stacked against you, I think is an inspiring thing. And I think it's something that needs to be appreciated more. And we can always do more of it. And so I think this is a slight call up your mama, call up your sister, and I think a simple thank you goes a long way. But it's more than just saying we appreciate you, but it's here are the tangible spaces and the money, right? And the spaces and the love and the appreciation in tangible ways so that they can continue doing what they do.
Yeah. I guess we can kind of close off on the last point, but what advice would you have as someone like yourself who is a well-spoken Muslim woman professional who's involved in a public space? What's your message to a lot of those sisters out there whose families will demean them, right? And tell them like, oh, you're lucky we're even letting you go to college. Oh, you took all my money. Oh, you have to get married right away, right? When you hit 20, that's it. Whether you're done with school or not, you had to figure it out in 2 to 3 years. And these are instances of that I have actually heard myself. Like, and a lot of Muslim women are barely, iron. I guess no pun intended, but like they're literally gasping for air. From your own like experiences and your own research and your own like self reflections, what would your advice be to those struggling Muslim sisters out there and even brothers?
Yeah, and I think it would. The first thing, like you mentioned, I wouldn't even address the women. I think it's the people. And I think the message to our community members and people around us is that they need to recognize that Muslim women are gasping for air and that they need the support. I'm grateful and blessed to have family that supported me in my college education and my career. I'm immensely grateful to have a husband who's super supportive as well. And I think we need our men to first be involved and aware and be supportive and to be true allies beyond saying Islam supports women's rights, okay? Because I think I had this one super sweet, well-meaning uncles come to, I think it was an ISNA panel that I was speaking at, who was just like, we need to tell America that the hijab isn't oppressive, right? And I want to be like, that's not the problem, right? Like how many articles out there that discuss the issue of hijab and modesty, and that's not the point. We're not here to talk about the piece of cloth over a woman's head. I think we need to talk about the depth and the humanity of it. And I would just say it's super important for us to be supportive of Muslim women who have these dreams and these aspirations and not make it impossible for them. I think sometimes we can be, we as a community are the biggest obstacles for each other to succeed. And I think we need to start breaking down a lot of those obstacles and being a lot more supportive of Muslim women who are in these creative spaces, who are being different, who are not going to be just, you could be an OBGYN and help your fellow Muslim sisters, or that's it. Like you can't do anything else, as if becoming an OBGYN is something you can do overnight, right? It's incredibly difficult. And I think having that support is important to being there. And I think for Muslim women, I think seeking out that sisterhood, I'm so grateful. And I think about all the Muslim women in my life who are doing amazing things. And I think there's something inspiring being able to talk out with another Muslim woman and to share ideas and to ask her, how did you balance the cultural expectation? How did you balance talking to your family? How did you balance being married or not being married? How do you prioritize all of these things in your life? So I think we need to foster a stronger sisterhood among one another. And I think we can take comfort within one another as women. Because sometimes if we feel like our men are failing us, then we should turn to one another to find that support and that love. And I think there are spaces and organizations that are doing more of it, but I think we can welcome a lot more.
Awesome.
Cool. I just had one more question. Can you give us an example of a situation where someone has been impacted by your work? Maybe you, any mindset you've changed or someone that you've affected positively?
So I think there are two that I hold near and dear to my heart that helped me get me through my tough days. As a Muslim woman journalist and as a visible Muslim, I get a lot of hate quite often, whether it's criticism, not just from within our community, but a lot of white supremacist men in their basements like to send me really vicious things. And so I have to balance that out with a lot of positivity. So the two that I check in with, after my swimming story, I had gotten this email that I have starred and saved in my inbox that I read often, who tells me that she was a very devout religious woman and a Christian woman who had very harsh perceptions of Muslim women. And she goes on in this incredibly honest and detailed email where she says, I judge Muslim women. I don't like the way they dress. I feel bad for them and I pity them. And I've been doing this over years and I may have mistreated some in my life. And she said that when she had read my swimming story, that it had opened her eyes in ways that she could not help but start crying and had felt immensely guilty for. And she was just like, and I don't know why it took a swimming story for this to have such a profound impact on me. But she goes on and tells me how awful she felt and how she truly wanted to be a woman of faith, just faith generally, that she was going down the wrong path and that she had vowed to herself and wanted to hold herself accountable, which is why she wrote the email and said, I'm speaking this into existence. And she had sent me this email. And I tried reaching out to her, but she disappeared. And I think she kind of wanted that one and done situation. And so that, I think, meant had a profound impact on me. And the second one was this amazing Syrian couple that I had met out in Arizona, Ramiz, who was engaged to a Syrian woman, Esma, who was stuck in Turkey. And so I've written extensively about the Muslim ban. I've been covering the Muslim bans that had happened in 2017. And so I was profiling what they were going through. And he was just felt this huge gap in his life of not having his childhood sweetheart, someone who he had known for ages. And he was describing to me the turmoil that he was facing and how hard it was for him to kind of just live a happy life in this immense depression he was facing. And so I was highlighting his story as to, this issue of family separation and what the Muslim ban was doing to families. And after I had published this profile, just SubhanAllah, without any emails to DOD or the Department of State, he had gotten an email a few weeks later saying that his wife's visa was approved.
Wow,
and
mashallah.
Because of our reporting, not even 2 months later, she was put on a plane from Syria to Europe to Washington, D.C., and then finally to Arizona, and was able to reunite with her husband. And I check in on them with often, and they're touring the U.S., and they were actually able to speak in Congress together. And just one couple that I will not get enough of PDA of, and they send me their selfies, and I'm just so incredibly happy to know that our report was able to reunite one more family despite the Muslim ban. So I think those are two things that help me go to bed at night and get me through the work that I do.
That's
Awesome.
amazing. And so we're here with Rowaida Abdelaziz.
Where can people find you?
Yeah.
I'm on Twitter at Rowaida_Abdel, ABDEL, because Twitter wouldn't let me have my full last name. I just cut it off there. And you could also find my work at the HuffPost website.
Awesome. So we can just search you up and then just find your articles and they
Yes.
come up. Awesome.
Yeah. Thank
So,
you so much
thank
for
you so
coming
much.
to TNEC and giving us your time and your insights. And it's honestly been an honor to have you on the podcast. And we hope to have you back again.
Looking
For
forward
sure.
to coming back. Thank you for having me.
I'm sure there's a lot to talk about in the future. So
Yeah.
I'd love to have you
Definitely.
back. Thank you so much. You guys have been listening to Faith in Fine Print. My name is Alman Nusrat,
And this is Nihal Khan.
thank you for listening. Until next time, peace be with you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.